Hello! Today I'm sitting in front of my beautiful new bookcases and wanted to tell you about all the books I read in September. Chronologically, the first book I read was The Sympathizer by, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, I think it's Viet, Nguyen, something like that. This book won the Pulitzer Prize last year and I read it together with my book club. We all had high hopes for it. It starts in 1975, during, I guess, the fall of Saigon, and our main characters flee to America, and he continues working as a mole for the North Vietnamese communists, sort of cozying up to everyone in America who still thinks that time will come. Growing up in Germany, I actually knew very little about the Vietnam War, so I did appreciate getting some of the facts, I guess, and an account of someone who wasn't as biased, so not some big Hollywood movie totally washing over the gruesomeness of the situation in Vietnam and just celebrating war heroes. And interestingly, the part of the book that I liked the best was actually when the sympathizer, the main character, he travels to, I'm not quite sure, I think it's the Philippines, where this filming company wants to film a movie about the Vietnam War. Doesn't actually go to Vietnam though, and he just depicts the phoniness and the absurdness of staging this glorified version of a really flawed and biased account of a war that's only just tentatively over, I guess. And that scene or that chapter I thought was done really, really well. And I think I hoped for more of that. I think the middle part of the book just really slowed down for me. He's in America and it's interesting, I guess, how he sort of basically is telling the story of immigrants, refugees, and how they sort of try to make a living in America. These sort of well-off people who now run a liquor store or work as assistants somewhere where they're just highly overqualified. And that was interesting. I just didn't quite, I thought the tone of the book was unnecessarily complicated at times. Not difficult to read, just wordy. I personally, although we did disagree within the book club, I personally really didn't get on with the depiction of women in the book. They're all sort of either perfect or sluts, and just all the male characters, in my opinion, just got far more interesting, nuanced characters, and the women are just sort of prototypes for something else I felt like he wanted to talk about. Some people in my book club said like, oh, well, it's like the women as symbols for the country, and I just, no, women don't have to be symbols for a country, they can actually be people. So that sort of ilks me a little bit. Also, I just got a bit annoyed with our main character. Besides being torn between the American culture where he's gone to college and the people he gets to know whilst spying on them, and the communist side that he politically, ideologically feels more akin towards, he's also torn as a character between his Vietnamese identity, being born to a Vietnamese mother, and having a French dad who was always absent and who he dislikes. So there's also these two sort of cultural identities at play. And even though that should be really interesting to me, I have a German mother and an English father, not quite as exotic, but I can relate to the feelings of not quite knowing which one is your country. I just thought he was really needlessly dramatic about it as well. So yeah, I liked it the least in my book club. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars, I think, because there were just some really poignant scenes in there, some really interesting contemplations, and I liked the different view on the Vietnam War that I've not come across in that way so far. 3 out of 5 for me. I see what the book was doing, it was just not made for me. Then the second book I read, I guess, comes to a very similar conclusion, even though the book is totally different. I also read this one on my Kindle, so I don't have you a pretty physical book to show you. And it's An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. By, I have to check the author's name, I wrote it down. It was Chris Hadfield, I don't remember this. Chris Hadfield is a Canadian astronaut, and in this non-fiction book, he talks about his life as an astronaut and what we normal people can learn from his education, basically, and the way that astronauts are taught to problem solve. I first heard of this book, I think, on a book riot podcast, and really liked how they pegged it, because the part they emphasized, and that was also the part I enjoyed in the book, was how astronauts are basically taught to always expect the worst, and that not necessarily being a pessimistic way of life, but just a cautionary way of living, and also meaning that if you always expect the worst, you can also take countermeasures and prevent the worst from always happening. So potentially actually really positive, because it always means that you have the best possible outcome, because you always prevent bad things from happening. That was unnecessarily complicated. It's very simplified in the book, and I did like that part. The reason why I didn't love the book was that it's a lot about his career and how he made it up the ladder, and I guess that's impressive, but I just wasn't very interested in that. I mean, I think being an astronaut, that's a cool job, that's a job kids dream about, but I don't think it's more fascinating than how someone ends up in any other kind of job, to be really honest. So maybe this is more something for people who are more into astronaut stuff, not even astrophysics, because he doesn't even talk about much of the science behind it. It's more how you actually get there, and also an account of a just very incredibly driven, career-focused person, which that, I guess, is actually interesting. Then a book that is actually more down my alley, and maybe that's also why I enjoyed it more. This one I do have in physical copy. It's Hot Milk by Deborah Levy. Annoyingly, her surname is covered here. This is the story of a 20-something-year-old called Sophia, who follows her mum, or accompanies her mum, to Spain to see a specialist because her mother sporadically can't walk and is in great pain. And this story doesn't have that much to it, like on the paper, but it really spoke to me as someone in a similar age. Sophia's really struggling with what she wants to do with her life. She's kind of skipped out on her PhD and really quite disillusioned, but at the same time she's still quite charismatic, and this book is, I think, actually quite a powerful story about female sexuality, and the love and responsibility you feel towards your parents, but also how stifling and suffocating it can be, and how detached you can feel from your parents at times as well, from other people on the whole, for that matter. I thought this was really beautifully written, and you do have to like the kind of book that doesn't follow a really engrossing plot. Like, not loads happens. You have to like characters that aren't always super likable, and maybe I was just also the perfect person to read this book, and I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. For it to be a 5-star read, maybe it needed to have a little bit more meat, but I really liked it. I really did. Then the next book I read, I still have from the library, although I will have to give it back soon, is The 10th of December by George Saunders. I've never read anything else by George Saunders, and the whole packaging, the foreword, the blurb on the back, everything about it is just a declaration of love towards George Saunders, which probably works for people who know the author, but I've never read anything by him. So for me, that just sets a really high expectation. And then unfortunately, that's really difficult to fulfill. This book is a collection of short stories written by George Saunders, and as is the case, or the danger with short story collections, some I loved, some I didn't. The blurb on the back promises a, what does it say? Dark visions of the future against the ghost of the past. And I almost feel like all the short stories that concern themselves more with slightly futuristic views, those I really liked, which fits with me enjoying sort of fantasy and sort of sci-fi themes. And all the short stories I didn't like concern themselves a lot with sort of just human emotion of envy and hating your everyday life, and kind of envy that's linked to people feeling poor and wanting what, in their opinion, a happy, rich life was. Very materialistic, and that kind of got repetitive to me, and those themes then overshadowed other nuances in the small stories that I wasn't able to see anymore, because I was just reading these people who I just thought were really annoying and feeling sorry for themselves, and actually I didn't like. I liked the first short story. I really often have that. I like the first one. Maybe that's because similarly to sort of like music albums, they select the first one to reel you in, or I just still have a sort of fresh view on things, so I like it more because of that. I like the first one, and then there was one that sort of most strongly had a sort of sci-fi theme where prisoners who have committed horrible crimes can get out of prison, or classical prison, to go to this, to basically become guinea pigs of like drug testing. And the drugs aren't sort of aspirin, but the drugs sort of make you more eloquent, which is ironic because I can't find the words, or lower your inhibitions, increase your sex drive, stuff like that. And the main character is a prisoner or a participant in these studies. So that one I really liked. And then there were a few cool other ideas. There's this really sort of horrible imagery in one of the short stories where people who can afford it pay for foreign women to have an operation done on them where they can be strung up like pearls basically on a line, and then as sort of decorative items they are hung up in their foregardens. That was hella weird, but quite intriguing is the wrong word, but like quite powerful sort of metaphor. Maybe someone else enjoyed this more. Tell me, is someone like able to deduce much more from these stories than I am? I'd be quite curious to hear. Then the next book I read, I know was simple. I read Silent Child by Sarah Denzil. This psychological thriller follows, I think her name was Emma, who, during a flood, loses her 6-year-old son, and he's believed missing and then later declared dead because they find his anorak floating in like the river that broke over the banks. So yeah, that tragedy happens in a sort of flashback sequence in the book, and then 10 years later, the woman Emma is sort of starting to piece her life together again, and her son resurfaces. Now a 16-year-old, highly traumatized, mute, so obviously won't talk about what happened, and also doesn't communicate in other ways what happened to him, and they try to find out what happened. I quite like psychological thrillers, but it was so obvious what happened. Like, incredibly obvious. It was so obvious that I kept on reading, thinking that the author was purposefully leading me down that path so that she could then hit me from the side and I wouldn't see it coming. But she didn't do it. It was just always clear. I read it visiting a friend of mine, and that was actually quite a funny experience because she kept on asking me what had happened so far in the book, and I would tell her and then try to leave out things because I didn't want to spoil it for her in case she decided to read it, but she kept on pushing me. It was like, no, Faye, like, just tell me. So I told her everything, and it was really easy to tell the story in very few sentences. And when I was sort of 2/3 through, I told her who I thought was it and what had happened, and yeah, lo and behold, that's also why I could then tell her in the end, truly did happen. I feel like probably I spoiled this book for other people now, because now you kind of know that what you expect also happens, but maybe someone will enjoy the plot more. I don't know. I think there's better books out there along those lines, so I can't recommend. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I should give it less, but I gave it 3 because I couldn't stop reading it. I pushed through because I sort of hoped I was wrong, but I wasn't. So maybe we should bump that down. Another one that maybe the last book I read, and maybe I should also bump that rating down, was Darkness at Noon by Koestler. This book originally was published in 1940, and I had high expectations again. It follows a prisoner who supported the regime that has now imprisoned him. We don't find out where this is set. The names sound Russian to the ear that doesn't know any better, and it's obviously highly influenced by what was happening in Europe at the time, but I was disappointed that we don't actually really, there's not loads of world building, which in a way is interesting because the prisoner is isolated in a prison, so he doesn't really know what's going on, but we have so many flashbacks that there would be loads of opportunity to give the reader a bit more insight of what the political ideology actually was, a bit more information on like who there seems to be a sort of dictator figure, but we don't really find out that much. There's, in my opinion, quite a bit of sort of long-winded dialogue that I could have done without. There's an incredibly powerful scene though, where the main character explains how the prisoners communicate amongst each other, because everything's soundproofed, but they can communicate via knocks on the wall, like a certain system of the alphabet. There's a really, really powerful scene where someone is walked to his death, so is going to be killed, and all the prisoners almost start this wave of knocks along the cell doors, to sort of accompany the prisoner, and that was really really impressively written and hard to read, and I thought that was excellent. So for that alone, I think this is a good book. The rest disappointed me. Yeah, so those were the 6 books that I read in September. I'm hoping for some better stuff to come. At the moment, I'm trying to read a few books in parallel, mainly The Wool by, is it Hugh Howey, something like that, sci-fi book that we're going to be discussing in my book club next week, so I'm looking forward to that. Let me know what you're reading, what you have read, and what the best book was that you read last month. I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.